I'm Wilson Greene. My book is A Campaign of Giants, The Battle for Petersburg, and you're watching Author's Voice.
Welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. The program you're watching right now is House Divided. It is our Abraham Lincoln Civil War show here on Author's Voice. It was our first show that we did back when we called it Virtual Book Signing. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and I am your host for today. So thank you very much for joining us here at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. Today, the book we're going to talk about is A Campaign of Giants, The Battles for Petersburg. The author is A. Wilson Greene, and we are going to meet Will Greene here in just a moment. But like I said, it comes to us from University of North Carolina Press. It is first edition. The cost is $45. Order it online while we are talking about it, and will sign it for you, and we will ship it out to you wherever you are in the world, be it Perth, Australia, or Frankfurt, Germany. Two places where you are ordering books from us, and we thank you for doing that. Okay, if you're watching this program on Facebook Live, on our Facebook feed, please use the comments section to submit a comment. I have you open right here, and I can look at your questions, and we'll give them to Will, and he'll answer them for you. If you're watching the program through our website, authorsvoice.net, if you're doing that, you can put a comment right on the website there. It's right below the viewer, and you can do that, and you can leave the comment. Again, I'll get it right here on my handy-dandy iPad, and we will answer the questions for you. I would prefer it if we just asked your questions, because that's what Author's Voice is all about. It connects you to the author so that you can ask your questions, you can meet your favorite authors, and then you can get a signed book. Always remember to order the signed book, because you buying the books is the reason why we're able to bring these programs to you. The reasons why the publishers like University of North Carolina Press can help us put on these programs. Now, I want to do a shout out before we get deep into this, because one other way that we can connect you with your favorite authors, you at home with your favorite authors, is through podcasting. Now, we don't do podcasting yet, but watch out. It's somewhere in the future. And so at some point in the future, rather than risking arrest by driving down the street trying to watch this video on your phone, we'll give you a podcast so you can listen to it, and then the police won't give you a ticket for watching Author's Voice. But I want to shout out to one of our good friends, Jerry Prokopovich, who I think has one of the finest Civil War podcasts out there, and it's certainly the original Civil War podcast, Civil War Talk Radio. And if you're interested in hearing fine discussions with the best authors of the newest books about Civil War, about the American Civil War, check out Civil War Talk Radio. And you'll find it at Jerry's website. It's called Impediments of War. I didn't write it down, but you can Google it. Impediments of War, Civil War Talk Radio. Hello, Jerry. Thank you very much for what you do. You're one of the best. Now let's meet A. Wilson Greene. Will Greene, welcome to Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. A. Wilson Greene is a native Chicagoan and a White Sox fan.
Which is very difficult to be these days.
Very difficult to be these days.
But we're loyal.
But he insisted that I say it out loud on the internet. Will is the former president of Pamplin Historical Park and the National Museum of the Civil War Soldier in Petersburg, Virginia. He's the author previously of the final battles of the Petersburg Campaign, now the author of A Campaign of Giants. Will was also one of the founders, one of the 7 founders of the organization that is now the American Battlefield Trust. And I know that a lot of you people out there know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about the American Battlefield Trust. Will, tell us about the founding of American Battlefield Trust. Where were you?
Well, we were in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and most of us were National Park Service historians who didn't have a clue about how to start a nonprofit organization. But as they say, we were mad as hell and wouldn't take it anymore. There was an issue that some of your viewers might remember in Manassas about the destruction of a battle called the Battle of Chantilly. Yes. And there was no friend of Chantilly to stand up for that battlefield. And so we decided that we would try to start a nonprofit whose goal was to purchase land that had significance during the Civil War. And by golly, we sent out notices to all of our contacts. We had a meeting in Fredericksburg, about 100 people attended, and we came up with this awful name, the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, which has no acronym that you can pronounce. But by golly, we were successful in getting that as volunteers, and then I took a leave of absence from my National Park Service job in 1990, and it was going so well that I actually did that full-time for 5 years, and the organization kept getting bigger. There was another organization that was also saving Civil War battlefields at the time, and I think in 1999, our organization and that one, which was called the Civil War Trust, I think, at that point, merged and became the Civil War Preservation Trust, then the Civil War Trust, and now the American Battlefield Trust, which is doing just fantastic work.
Right.
Every one of your viewers who cares about preserving battlefields in the United States should be a member.
And they are very talented at using the same medium that you're watching right now. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can watch Gary Edelman do all of his live stream broadcasts from Gettysburg, or sometimes he goes other places.
I just heard from Gary 2 days ago, and we're going to be together at Chickamauga in September doing one of those live anniversary programs on the battlefield.
Oh, you're going to have a great time. You're going to have a great time doing that. Okay, to the important topic of the day. First question, will the White Sox trade Jose Abreu?
I hope not. I hope not, because when you have a team batting average that's already about 220 and you lose your 280 hitter, you're really in trouble.
All right, folks at home, that's all the White Sox for the time being.
Mercifully.
Yeah, unless we decide to talk about the White Sox some more because we love the White Sox. Okay, Will, why did you take on this remarkable endeavor? Here's the first volume, the first 700-page volume of what's going to be a 3-volume definitive history of the Petersburg Campaign. Why take this?
Well, it was too expensive to get a rope to self-flagellate, so I decided that I would take on this writing project instead. No, this was something that I encouraged all of my colleagues in history that they should do, because there's a gap in the literature. There has not been really an operational history of this gigantic campaign that lasts 292 days, has 9 separate Union offensives, 2 separate Confederate offensives, several very elaborate cavalry raids, and it is not, contrary to the stereotype, it's not a static siege. It's a very vibrant campaign, but it's very complex. And it occurs on both sides of the James River. It occurs on both sides of the Appomattox River. It deals with the 7th largest city in the Confederacy. It spans one of the most important elections in American history, about which the soldiers had a great deal of thought. And I just think it's been, a topic that folks just hadn't wanted to tackle. And frankly, I didn't either. I was hoping someone would do it. And when no one bit, I talked to my good friend Gary Gallagher, who was the editor of Civil War America series at the University of North Carolina Press, who encouraged me to tackle the project, and so here we are.
Right. Well, for generations, the Petersburg Campaign was conspicuously absent from Civil War writing. But I do say, even though there's a gap that this is going to fill, we are in what some might call a golden age of Petersburg writing.
I would agree.
Probably, great works from Summers, Trudeau, Horn, Kevin Levin with his memory study, Earl Hess, Barson Calkins, and yourself have all, you've all tackled this this project. And but what do you think accounts for the surge in fine writing fairly recently about the campaign. Your
Right.
project is going to be the first comprehensive operational study. But every one of these great writers had something to say.
Well, and you didn't mention one of the best is Hampton Newsom's
Oh, yeah.
book on Richmond Must Fall, on the 6th Petersburg Offensive.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can explain why there's such an interest, except that people have realized that no one has written about these major battles.
Yeah.
We have innumerable books on important places like Chancellorsville and Antietam. Of course, Gettysburg is in a category all its own. But some of these engagements that involved tens of thousands of soldiers and thousands of casualties on both sides had been ignored.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think people in our field have realized that here is a ripe area for innovative, original scholarship.
Mm-hmm. And I think to add to that, the fact that the database, if you only take what's right there printed in the OR, is huge. And if there was a reason why they didn't write it before, maybe some people were frightened.
Well, yeah, and I think there is some truth to the idea that Petersburg has been portrayed as a static siege. It's often called the siege, and that's okay. My good friend Dick Summers and I have a running joke about him insisting it's a siege, and I am insisting it's not. And if Dick says it's right, he probably is right. I would defer to him. But in reality, no matter what semantics you use, this was a very complicated operational task that the commanders had to face. There's 4 armies involved, of course. I mean, the Confederates have the Army of Northern Virginia, but for a good deal of the campaign, Beauregard's army was a separate force, and Lee treated Beauregard as a separate commander. And of course, there's the Army of the James and the Army of the Potomac on the Union side. I think part of the reason Petersburg hasn't captured the imagination of writers and visitors to battlefields and readers of books prior to this is that some of the main characters are not as familiar to Civil War students as the John Reynolds or the Jeb Stuarts, people who have been knocked out of the war by the time they get to Petersburg. So we have a cast of characters that are not quite as familiar as some others. And I also think there's something to be said for the fact that the campaign is so large, has such a large geographic footprint, and until the last generation, so little of it had been preserved and accessible. I think people's perception of what's significant is related to what they can see. And so one of the reasons that it's so important to preserve these places is that it allows those places to speak about their significance to modern generations. If something is lost, it tends to be forgotten, lost in the sense of being developed.
If the ground is lost.
The ground is lost, right. Yeah. And so Petersburg, although there's a great deal of terrain that still could be preserved, and the Civil War Trust and other organizations have done a great job in the last 15 years of more than doubling the amount of acreage around Petersburg that has been preserved and is accessible for visitors. There's still a lot that people could read about, but they really don't know where to go to visit them. Mm-hmm. The operations north of the James come to mind. Right. Huge operations by the Army of the James and General Lee's army, but very little has been preserved by the National Park Service. And so people, when you say first deep bottom or second deep bottom, their eyes kind of glaze over because they haven't had a chance to visit those fields and understand what happened and why it was important.
And without going into those, both fields, where visiting the field is incredibly important to understanding what happened.
Absolutely. Any military history.
Now, we mentioned before that you're an admirer of our friend George Rabel.
I am.
And
don't tell him, though. I said so.
Too late. We said it on the internet.
Quiet.
George is a great guy. He's been on this show. He did with the book about the almost chosen.
God's almost chosen.
What a great book that was.
Wonderful book.
But also Fredericksburg, his Battle of Fredericksburg narrative has sometimes been talked about as breaking ground in what's called new military history. Put the quotes on that. Now, do you think there is a kind of movement toward a new military history or not? The answer might be no. But what elements define some of the changes that are occurring in military history writing that you see in a book like Fredericksburg or A Campaign of Giants that you don't see 50 years ago, 75 years ago?
Well, I think the obvious answer, and George did a real pioneering job on this, but the new military history considers the cultural, social, economic context in which military campaigns were conducted, and the political context as well. Whereas traditional military history is bugles and sabers. It's only the decisions by, and usually it's a top-down kind of approach to military history, where the emphasis is on Lee's lieutenants, on the commanders, the corps commanders or the army commanders, not so much the viewpoint of the common soldier. And what I've tried to do is to incorporate what the local folks in Petersburg were experiencing during the campaign, and also explore the perspectives of the common soldiers, black soldiers, white soldiers, Confederate soldiers, Union soldiers. And there's, not surprisingly, a tremendous diversity in viewpoints from all of these characters who participated in this particular campaign.
Mm-hmm. So the voice of the soldier, which is something we've seen more recently, if you talk about the last 30 years or something like that, and which is not necessarily to criticize John Bigelow and his history of Chancellorsville, but who back then had access to all of this primary source material, manuscript material, letters, diaries, who finally going back to look at the newspapers in a systematic way. Now we can.
Well, there's an embarrassment of riches when it comes to Petersburg. When you think of about 200,000 individual soldiers, most of whom were literate, writing letters for 6, 8, 9 months, the volume of material is staggering. I'm sure that some of my colleagues, when they tackle a project, are searching hard for the material they need in order to write a reasonably comprehensive treatment of their topic. In my case, it's a matter of what do I have to leave on the cutting room floor in order to tell the story within the page limit that the good folks at Chapel Hill give to me. Mm-hmm. Because right now I have more than 100 expandable file folders of material that I've collected on the story of Petersburg, much more than I could possibly use, and most of it coming from the pens of private soldiers.
There's the first really literate generation
Absolutely.
In American history. Thus, the old name that they used to call the Civil War when I was a kid, the Second American Revolution. So many, of course, that was political with emancipation, the overthrow of slavery, but so many other things were revolutionary were happening at the time. The Industrial Revolution, suddenly people were literate. Normal people were literate, and they left behind.
Well, 90% of Union soldiers were literate, and 80% of Confederate soldiers were literate. Mm-hmm. And when we say literate, of course, we're not saying that they have perfect grammar. In fact, that's one of the wonderful things about reading soldier letters is that they spell phonetically a lot of times if they're not really well educated. And so you get an idea of the accents that people had and how they pronounce different words by the phonetic spelling in their letters, which is just one of the many pleasures of reading original Civil War manuscripts.
You get to know them better. I'm gonna do a little change on our chronology here, because since we brought up this concept of revolution, one of the revolutions happening at the time was technological. And one of the things that your soldiers had that others didn't were photographs. Now, this is an artifact we have for sale here at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, and there are the cartes de visite, the visiting cards. I don't know the exact date, but probably maybe the late 1850s is the beginning of the ability to reproduce photographs on paper. Of course, we'd had daguerreotypes before there. You could get a glass, a one-off thing and take it home, and that's here. But suddenly, you can walk home with a stack of photographs, and suddenly everybody wants to collect the photographs of important people. And then they take them to the important people, and they get what?
They get their autographs.
They get their autograph. It's the beginning of the signed photograph.
Absolutely.
That's
and the war created such a demand
Yeah.
that had not existed for that kind of a product before.
Right. And so here you see signed carte de visite. As you saw, we have them framed together. We're selling them together. Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander, with Mary Custis Lee, his wife. The Robert E. Lee photograph, for those of you who are collectors and aficionados, is a life image with a Vanderson and Jones back mark. Vanderson and Jones of Richmond, famous photographers, took a lot of significant people. And there you go. Those are the signatures of Lee and Mary Custis Lee. And if you're interested in asking us about acquiring this, yeah, I can help you do that. Contact us at alincolnbookshop.com through our website, or you can look at it there, or just give us a call. We'll talk to you about how to get you these photographs. Tell us this. Of course, this brings up one of our commanders, Robert E. Lee. What do we need to learn about Robert E. Lee and Petersburg that we don't already think we know?
Well, this goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago in the concept that there's no contingency at Petersburg. In other words, that Lee is quoted often in the literature as telling Jubal Early, one of his commanders, when the armies are still around Richmond, that if the Union Army gets across the James River, I'm paraphrasing, that it will become a siege, and then it will be a mere question of time. And that has been quoted ad nauseum as an example of how the die has been cast, that there is no contingency at Petersburg, and Lee admitted it and saw it coming. Well, first of all, I'm not sure whether Lee really ever said that. He might have. He said something similar later that has better documentation than that particular quote that is so often used. But Lee evidenced no knowledge or inclination that the Civil War was over when he came to Petersburg. I think that no matter what he said, he didn't act that way. And in this first volume, there are a couple of things that we have to touch on regarding Lee's generalship. I think one of the most talked about is whether General Grant actually fooled Lee in getting across the James River. Was Lee fooled? Did Grant pull one over on Lee? And was Lee, a corollary to that is, was Lee tardy in responding to Grant's movement across the James, and therefore placing Petersburg in dire peril, only to be saved by the combination of good generalship by Beauregard and bad performance by the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James. So we go into a little bit of that, and not to give away the whole story, but I think Lee is largely exonerated from those accusations. I think he acted reasonably based on the information that he had. And we have to bear in mind that one of Lee's primary responsibilities was protecting the Confederate capital. And until he could be positive that the bulk of the Army of the Potomac had actually stopped threatening Richmond directly and was south of the Appomattox and James Rivers, at that point he finally pulled the trigger and sent his army down to reinforce Beauregard. Beauregard performed very well between June 15th and 18th. However, if you look at the correspondence that he sent Lee, it was very mercurial and very contradictory. In one message it might be, we are in dire peril, I may have to give up the city, and then 8 hours later he would be requesting reinforcements with which he could drive the Yankees back across the river. And Lee was trying to respond to these mixed messages he was getting from his lieutenant on the scene at Petersburg. Beauregard also failed to identify the units of the Union Army that had crossed the river. And so Lee was unaware of where the majority of the Army of the Potomac was, even though it was facing Beauregard. So, I mean, it's a longer story than that. We don't want to go into all the details. But it's a little bit controversial about Lee's performance there, and I think he comes off a little bit better maybe than some of the treatments he's received in the past.
Well, one of our historians that has covered this this recently, and I didn't include him in the list of Petersburg historians because he's only just, but it's Gordon Ray.
My good friend Gordon.
Yes, has written these remarkable series of books about the Overland Campaign, and his most recent one brings General Grant across the river there. And I recommend, while I recommend Will's book for a fine, concise description of that, a full-length treatment of whether or not Grant stole the march, and that's what you find in Gordon Ray's book. And then Gordon brings the Army of the Potomac to Petersburg, and there's some fighting, which brings me to the question I want to ask of you. June 15th, attack on Petersburg. For your purpose, what event defines the opening of the Petersburg campaign? And I don't think I mean that just as arbitrarily where you're going to cut off, the previous story and start telling this one. When does Petersburg become the goal?
Well, this is Grant's apparent goal as he's moving across the James River. And incidentally, Gordon and I are great friends. We collaborate all the time since our books overlapped a little bit, and we pretty much see eye to eye. There's not a whole lot of there's a few things that we disagree on, but not too many. And we both agree that although we are admirers of Grant, perhaps I'm more of an admirer of Grant than even Gordon is, that for some reason Grant's brilliant movement to the James River, and it was brilliant, did not translate into an equally brilliant offensive on June 15th or on subsequent days. And the gist of the problem was his failure to communicate with the four subordinate officers who were critical to exercising this offensive. And those officers would be the Army commanders, George Gordon Meade and Benjamin Franklin Butler, and the two Corps commanders whose troops would be involved in the assault, and that would be William Farrar Smith, Butler's commander of the 18th Corps, and Winfield Scott Hancock, Meade's commander of the 2nd Corps. Those were the troops that were involved, and inexplicably, Grant never got all four of those fellows on the same page. The communication was very poor, and as a result, neither Smith nor Hancock understood their mutual roles in this offensive, and Grant remained rather aloof from the operation, which is one of the themes that I have discovered. And I should hastily add that I am not one of this small cadre of Grant haters. There are a number of books.
Small and shrinking.
Well, I don't know if it's shrinking, because there are several new publications that have come out that are very critical of Grant, very revisionist on Grant. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to be lumped into that, because I think Grant was one of the preeminent commanders of the Civil War. But these first 6 weeks at Petersburg, Bjorn, were not his best moments. And June 15th, I think, if you want, there's plenty of blame to go around. You can blame Smith, who gets most of the traditional criticism. You can blame Hancock. You can blame Butler. But the guy who's supposed to be coordinating all of that is the General-in-Chief. And Grant does not do a particularly good job on June 15th.
Mm-hmm. And and that June 15th that leads us to that first battle of Petersburg. I think what I can do here, one of the things I want to feature about your book that is remarkable is great map making. Great map making, and very helpful in the narrative.
Well, that's a credit to my colleague Edward Alexander, who actually did the maps. We worked hard together on them. Edward's a young historian who is part of that emerging Civil War series.
Fine series.
And he worked with me at Pamplin Historical Park, and I think Edward's got a great future, not only as a cartographer, but as a writer.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the maps that is so helpful to this and remarkable in telling a lot of stories is your map of the city of Petersburg. When you introduce Petersburg to the people, there it is, the people at home can see it. And it helps to introduce Petersburg as one of the characters in the book. And it matters who's in Petersburg, where they live, what they're experiencing. Where's the commerce? That matters to the outcome of the operations. And including the first battle, the Couts battle, the Battle of the Old Men and the Little Boys. And things like that. So if you just briefly comment on Petersburg as a character and the people of Petersburg.
Well, Petersburg was the 7th largest city in the Confederate States, and the only one your viewers could probably tick off with fairly good accuracy the other 6. But I doubt if we asked too many people to name the seven largest cities in the Confederacy, that Petersburg would appear on the list. It's the only one of the 7 that never really got big. Petersburg today is 35,000 people. But in 1860, it was the 2nd largest city in Virginia, second only to Richmond. It had the largest percentage of free people as African Americans of any city in the South. So it had an extremely vibrant, free black community. Like Richmond, it was an industrial city. It was not a market town like so many of the cities in the South. It was a hub of tobacco manufacturing, iron manufacturing, flour mills, the northernmost city in the South that both grew and processed cotton, the hub of 5 railroads, the head of navigation on the Appomattox River, and a very wealthy and progressive, economically viable city with all of the trappings that a 19th century American city would want to have culturally. And so Petersburg was an important goal in its own right. It had an industrial capacity that the North would want to have, and a transportation network by 1864 that was critical to the Confederate war effort. But you had a large number of these people that lived in a city that was not surrounded, but imperiled by a very large enemy army. Now, there were a few towns like that in the American Civil War. Of course, Vicksburg is a primary example. Atlanta comes to mind. But Petersburg doesn't take second fiddle to any of those towns in terms of having an experience that was unusual for the people of the Civil War era. So one of the things that I try to do in my book is tell the story of the campaign from the perspective of the citizens in Petersburg. Mm-hmm. The women, the African Americans, the soldiers that came through Petersburg, the patients. It was a large hospital center. I wrote a book in 2006, I think, published by the University of Virginia Press, called Civil War Petersburg, Confederate City in the Crucible of War, mm-hmm. which I go into more detail about the history of Petersburg. It's a very interesting city.
And do you have a lot of stories? Did these citizens give you a lot of
there are a lot of, unfortunately, there are very few sources from African Americans. And that is, I think, a lament that all historians who write in this period have. A very limited number of, we can rely on newspapers and just a handful of source material. But yes, there were quite a few sources that gave us an insight into what it was like to live in a city. Bjorn, it's so modern. The reaction of the people in Petersburg and the government was, would be translated to 21st century America. Welfare became an important aspect. The city took a much stronger hand in the daily lives of the people who lived there. It goes on, but I'm struck by how, and it really shouldn't be a surprise, those of us who study history realize that there is a pattern to history. We can learn from history, and what went on in Petersburg in the 1860s would be very familiar to people of the 21st century today.
Right. And in a few minutes, we'll get to the activities that happen later in the book. But one of the things about your writing is you do include citizens and slaves and so on and so forth in that last chapter of the book. We'll get to it in a moment, but I want to bring up something else. We have a question from the audience, and again, this time we're pleased to have another one of our leading historians and citizens and natives of Wheaton, Illinois, submit a question for you. Peter Cousins has sent us a question. Hello, Peter. Thank you very much. Peter Cousins is the author of the Gilder Lehrman Award-winning The Earth is Weeping that was featured on this program in 2016. And it's a fantastic book. And he's working on another one. We're gonna meet Peter again. But Peter asks, how did you manage? He's read the book and he enjoys it thoroughly. And he asks, how did you manage to balance the human interest stories and the very complex analysis to dig into the military operations? Before you answer, everybody keep an eye out on your Wall Street journals, because Peter Cousins has written a review of a book that we're both talking about right now. You're going to be able to see it in a few days. Needless to say, from this question, I think it's going to be a pretty friendly review.
I'm flattered, because Peter and I are both from the same town. We're both from Wheaton, Illinois, and I've always said that I was the second best Civil War historian to come out of Wheaton. I have a great admiration for Peter, and I think he knows the answer to that, because he does the same thing in a lot of his books. My task in dealing with the Petersburg Campaign is to try to discuss what happened from the perspective of a variety of perspectives. We've talked about from the civilian perspective. We certainly need to talk about Grant and Lee and all those command decisions that we mentioned in relationship to, say, June 15th. But I think we also need to hear from the common soldiers, the line officers, the non-commissioned officers, the privates, the fellows who were bleeding on the battlefield and suffering in the trenches. These fellows all had a voice, and it wasn't the same voice. There's a variety of different perspectives on whether or not to pursue the war. And with the Confederates, you can watch a transition amongst some Confederate soldiers from great optimism. And during the time period that A Campaign of Giants covers, the vast majority of Confederate soldiers are very optimistic about the outcome of the campaign. But in reading their letters later in the campaign, as I have done and will write about in future volumes, for some of those men, their perspective changes drastically. And I think that's very important. I mean, the performance of the Army of the Potomac and its failures during this first 6 weeks at Petersburg has a lot to do with the nature of the men in the Army. A lot of the best soldiers, the best and bravest, were lying on battlefields in Spotsylvania County and Caroline County and Hanover County. And the men who were replacing them were often people who were not as motivated for the pure reasons of the earlier enlistees. And it's interesting to read, for example, the reactions of veteran soldiers to these bounty men and these draftees. And you get a variety of opinions, but for the most part, there's some pretty colorful language that they use about how worthless some of those fellows really were. And the ones who became good soldiers, it took time. It took time for them to learn the craft from the veteran soldiers. So there's an evolution in the attitudes and performance of the soldiers on both armies. And I think that's a fascinating sub-story to the operational conduct of the campaign.
Right, and I think I wanted to point out that you have one particular episode, and there's a terrific map, one of the terrific maps that has this as one of the units that has this great social story in the first episodes of the battle is the case of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. Yeah. So here are these men who've only been in garrison duty up till now, big regiments the size of a division, and in just a few minutes they prove their mettle as soldiers.
Well, and that's, you bring that's interesting. There's, I don't want to sit here and say that I've turned the interpretation of Petersburg on its head. I certainly haven't. Lots of people have written very accurate, good stories, but one of the myths that has come down about the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery is that they were so naive that they went into this assault on June the 18th, 1864, against a fixed Confederate position in which they lost more men than any other regiment in any army in the entire Civil War, in all in about 10 minutes time. that it was born out of naivete. And in tracking down the correspondence from many members of that unit, you realize that's not true at all. They knew darn well that they were walking into a meat grinder and that many of them wouldn't come back. So it raises the question, why do men do these things? And the 1st Maine is an example of this incredible bravery in placing some concept of independence, union, whatever motivation you want to identify as driving these Civil War soldiers to these incredible acts of bravery. The 1st Maine Heavy Artillery was a good example of that. They knew what they were getting into.
Okay.
And out of 850 of them, 632 of them didn't come back.
Right. And that is a change. I'm not saying you're turning the interpretation on its head either, but that's a good that's a good point.
I think that's a
because it
that's
means
a myth.
a lot as to why they did what they did, and it was just this moment, but it was a life-shattering moment for these men and these communities. And
Oh, well, can you imagine, as we all know, most of these Civil War companies were raised in one community. And oftentimes the companies were combined into regiments from one geographic area. So can you imagine if you lose that many men in 10 minutes' time, what that does to the community back home? How many widows? How many women never had a chance to marry because the men in their town were all gone? I mean, the Civil War had such an impact beyond just the battlefield that I think this is why it has such enduring interest for writers and readers.
Well, we are rifling through our time. We're screaming through our time. We're only going to talk for an hour, and there's so much to cover. So the folks at home, we're not going to try to go through Will's book and talk about every chapter and everything that's happened. We're not going to try to chronologically cover everything. You'll have to buy it to do that. Buy it, he'll sign it, we'll ship it to you. But one thing that is different, again, about Campaign of Giants that you don't see in similar books, in some of the previous books, is you bring in some pretty far-flung operations that have not always been included in the campaign, but they deserve to be. And I think in terms of these cavalry.
I agree. There are several aspects of the whole Petersburg story that haven't received a monograph treatment, like some of the ones that you mentioned earlier on. Yeah, I mean the Wilson Couts raid, which was a massive cavalry operation that went through 12 Virginia counties and covered more than hundreds of miles, and had a major impact. It also had, incidentally, talking about different perspectives, tremendous impact on runaway slaves. The story of all of the slaves that were passed by this Union body and how many of those enslaved people joined the Union column, and then what happened to them when the Confederates stopped the raid and defeated the Union cavalry at the Battle of Reams Station. It's a very poignant story when you read about that. And the actions north of the James River, when Phil Sheridan was escorting the large wagon train across the James River, and there were cavalry actions at a place called Samaria Church.
Right.
And if you read the accounts of the soldiers involved in these engagements, it was a big deal to them. It may not be a household name to us, but if you read their accounts, in many cases, that was one of the most important days of their entire Civil War career. And of course, if you're a casualty, it is the biggest day of your career.
So yeah, and I think that brings that brings out the importance of needing to have something that falls into this new military history. I almost feel like I'm hesitant to say new military history because in my mind it's just really good military history. It's what it can be. Previous generations didn't have the ability. Now we do. We should take advantage of it. And
I agree. But I also think that in some precincts, your viewers may be familiar with, that military history in general is not considered a legitimate source of inquiry. And I, of course, would reject that. I think that in essence, what I'm trying to do is write an operational history of Petersburg Campaign. And I should hasten to say that if your viewers are thinking they're going to get a comprehensive tactical treatment of Petersburg, they'll be disappointed.
Okay.
Because I think you'd need 15 volumes to do justice to that. You mentioned Dick Summers' wonderful book, Richmond Redeemed.
Yes.
It's about a 700-page book. It deals with one of the offensives from September 29th to October 2nd. It's half of his dissertation. He cut the dissertation down by 50%. I don't know if you knew that. And the dissertation is online.
Yeah.
And the dissertation is like 1,500 pages. And that's on one of the offensives. That's on 4 days at Petersburg. And I'm dealing with 292 days. But within that framework, I hope that we can present readers with a full picture of what happened at Petersburg, and maybe people will come away thinking that this is an operation worth studying and a place worth visiting.
Mm-hmm. Good segue. You pitched me the segue as a softball.
Well, I tried, Bjorn. I'm an old radio guy. I know how to do that.
Because, before we get to the final hole in our story, I wanted to, because we do have to talk about what, the Battle of the Crater and all the controversy surrounding that, an incredibly important part of this book. But you bring to us, and I want you to spend some of your time with us to give us some of your perspective on being a public historian in the Petersburg area all these years. You were at the National Park Service. You preserved the battlefields. What is the importance around Petersburg, not just generally, because I'm not specific here, the importance of having access to the ground, the importance of Pamplin Park, the importance of preserving some of these forts?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, people's perception of what's important is linked to what they can visit and what's accessible. And I think the Civil War Trust has done a terrific job, American Battlefield Trust now, thanks to Gary Edelman and others at the Trust who have incorporated interpretation and access into their preservation efforts. And at Petersburg, what is unusual, not unique, but unusual, is the collaborative effort between a variety of different organizations. The National Park Service is the flagship at Petersburg, and they're the ones who've had a national battlefield, a national military park originally, since the late 1920s. And they are expanding their footprint of preserved land. The Civil War Trust, American Battlefield Trust, has done a great deal. Dr. Pamplin, who was the patron of Pamplin Historical Park, allowed us to save 422 acres of the Petersburg story. Organizations like the Conservation Fund have chipped in. There's a local organization now, the Petersburg Battlefields Foundation, that is working on saving these battlefields. We've come to the game a little late in Petersburg, but there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that Petersburg has been an economically challenged city since the 1980s, when its major employer left town. The good news is, because there has not been a great deal of economic development in the area, the opportunity to save these places is still there. They haven't been destroyed. They haven't been covered by shopping malls or subdivisions, although it's starting to get that way now. And just recently, the Congress passed legislation expanding the boundaries of Petersburg National Battlefield. That's the first step. Now they have to acquire the land, and they have to do that through willing sellers and so forth. But the opportunity, I think, is there, and if Petersburg National Battlefield fulfills its destiny of getting all of this land that's incorporated into their authorized boundary, it will be the largest battlefield park in the country.
Mm-hmm. Now, if they do it, and I'm going to speak some NPS public historian speak, if they can get these resources, and I've been to the Petersburg Battlefield, and I love what they do. What new resources will they get that will allow them to expand interpretation? What new stories can be told, because now we have this?
Well, Petersburg National Battlefield has always been challenged by its land base, and it's interpreted almost episodically. you move from Battery 5 and talk about June 15th, and then you move to March 25th and you talk about Fort Stedman, then you move to July 30th and you talk about the crater, and then you drive 10 miles and then you go out to some fort that doesn't really have a lot of context. That's not a criticism of the park, it's just a function of the land base. So I would hope that with additional properties that they can tell the complete story and link it together so that people understand it as a whole rather than just a series of isolated events that have no apparent relationship to one another. And the same thing would be true across the James River. Through a quirk of bureaucracy, we have 2 national battlefield parks. Richmond National Battlefield Park deals with the stories of the 7 Days battles, which is perfectly appropriate, but they also have a small land base of properties that deal with the 1864 campaign. Well, that's all part of the Petersburg story. And in an ideal world, that would be one battlefield park that would be integrated so that visitors could perceive it that way. So there's some challenges, but I think the future is bright for Petersburg in terms of its Civil War tourism. Yeah, I would encourage your visitors to think about, your viewers, to become visitors at Petersburg because there's so much to see. Between City Point, a fascinating story about the Union Supply Depot, all the way out to Five Forks, and then at Pamplin Historical Park, viewing the very well-preserved battlefield that ended the campaign on April 2nd, 1865.
Is there anything upcoming? Are there any
Land acquisitions?
planned acquisitions that you know about? And with Battlefield Trust.
There are some discussions going on that I probably shouldn't talk about, and they're being done by the American Battlefield Trust right now. That I hope will bear fruit.
Right.
But I think that there's enough now where when I lead tours at Petersburg, if people have the time, it's a 3-day experience.
Right.
And even then you're not seeing everything, but there's 3 days worth of battlefield tromping to do at Petersburg.
And I'll name names if you can. I know I haven't been there I haven't been there since, but now you can go to Petersburg and visit the battlefield of Rheims Station.
That's right.
And you could have done that before, of course. You could have driven down the road and parked and got out and
Exactly.
looked around. Now you can visit the battlefield of Rheims Station.
And the same is true with White Oak Road, and the same is true with a number of these. But the 6th Offensive, the Battle of Boyd and Plank Road, doesn't have a great land base.
Yeah.
The 2nd Offensive, which was the Battle of Jerusalem Plank Road, and the 2nd Offensive's never had a monograph. I think an historian is working on that right now, and I'm anxious to see his work. But it involved the capture of more than 2,000 federal soldiers. The capture of more than 2,000. How many battlefields in the Civil War saw that amount? And this was the vaunted 2nd Corps.
Yeah.
But people don't know about it, and people don't think about it because there's really not much there that you can visit. So I'm hoping that the combination of more literature on the story of the campaign and more of a land base will put Petersburg on the Civil War map.
Okay. Well, the final chapter of this book and the battlefield that turn that coin over, on the other side, the battlefield that is most heavily understood, visited, and people desire to see because of the story is the Battle of the Crater. And you take it up through the Battle of the Crater. So the Battle of the Crater has monographs. And therefore now we have a vigorous study and controversies over one aspect or the other. Therefore, what is it, briefly, because we're running out of time, what is this book's take on the Battle of the Crater, and how does your new perspective change the story of the Battle of the Crater that we think we know?
Well, there are several good books on the Battle of the Crater, a couple of bad ones as well. The good one is by Earl Hess. And an earlier book written...
And he was on the show and talked about
Well, Earl is one of our best historians. Yeah. And an earlier book by a fellow named Mike Cavanaugh and William Marvel, published in 1989, is also a very good book. Kevin Levin's study of the memory of the crater is excellent. So I'm not sure that I have anything particularly groundbreaking. I think maybe one of the aspects that has struck me when I read all the literature and wanted to wrap my arms around this story was the degree to which the Confederate Army was committing atrocities against the United States colored troops that made the assault. And Kevin has gone into a little bit of that in his book, but I think it's more pervasive, more disturbing, raises lots of real questions than perhaps most Civil War readers have appreciated. I found, I think, some new source material that demonstrates the degree to which Confederate soldiers considered the USCT troops as runaway slaves, subject to capital punishment, which was the cultural
Summary.
That was the cultural norm of the time. Also, bear in mind that the black troops were charging with the battle cry of no quarter, and no quarter means we're not taking prisoners. And that was the conventional wisdom amongst the Confederates, that if they were captured by African American soldiers, that they would be killed. I'm not excusing this by any means, but we're compelled to try to understand why otherwise honorable soldiers who 99% of the time acted within the mores of their culture would act so savagely at the Battle of the Crater. And also no repercussions, which is interesting. I found some accounts, newspaper accounts, that actually took General Mahone, the Confederate commander at the Crater, to task because Mahone apparently, and I think there's enough sources that say this, and I think it's true, called a halt to this slaughter of the black soldiers. And this editorial in a Richmond paper took Mahone to task and told him that next time they have a situation like this, he should take some whiskey or some brandy and water and get his courage up and slaughter all the black people. So these are disturbing realities, but rather than be judgmental, I think we're compelled to and obliged to try to understand. And I hope that what I've written leads us to a little bit of understanding.
Mm-hmm. And I think it does. It's really great work, and also a greater understanding of the United States colored troops who did the attacking, and to the extent that our challenge of not having a lot of letters and diaries and so on and so forth from these guys still flesh these guys out remarkably well.
Thank you.
And what they did, what they were trying to do, what they were trying to accomplish tactically, and then how they felt about their treatment.
Well, at Petersburg National Battlefield, I'm happy to say that the National Park Service has cleared a lot of non-historic woods, and I'm hoping that will lead to their ability to interpret the Confederate side of the battle. Up until now, it's all been about the construction of the mine, the explosion, and the failed Union attacks. Mm-hmm. We learned very little about the Confederate counterattacks. Mm-hmm. And hopefully with what the Park Service is doing there now, that they'll be able to tell a fuller story of the tragedy at the Crater.
That's good news. And again, I think this brings back one of your first points. We previously had a resource, and the resource was a hole in the ground. Right. And therefore, the story of the Battle of the Crater revolved around the hole in the ground.
Precisely.
But all of those acres that used to be a golf course, before it was a golf course, it was these, as Earl Hess pointed out, as you point out, it was these holes, these dugouts where the Confederates lived and where that counterattack came over that area.
That's right.
And if I'm right about where some of this clearance is happening, that's also some of that, from the Union perspective, right shoulder, where some of the USCT regiments did their fighting. Yeah, and so we're going to have a new story.
Well, the ravines, the terrain features that the Confederates used to get to the battlefield and to stage their assaults are all there. They just haven't been accessible up until now.
Right. Thank you very much, Will. Thank you very much. I'm going to get back to you here in a second, because before we wrap up our interview. But first, I want to do some housekeeping things with the folks at home. We are reaching the end of our time, I regret to say, because we're having a really good time on this broadcast. We've been talking about A Campaign of Giants by A. Wilson Greene. Comes to us from the University of North Carolina Press. It's 700 some pages. I forgot to write it down. And costs $45. You will be able to order it online after the event. We're going to keep copies, and so order it tomorrow. If you're watching this program on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, go ahead and go over to the authorsvoice.net website, go to the previous program site, find the book, order it, we'll send it to you. It'll be signed, and we'll get it there. Will not be able to add any pithy inscriptions because he'll already be gone, but you'll get a signed first edition. Thank you to the University of North Carolina Press for helping get Will here and for publishing this fine work. I want to tell you what's coming up on Author's Voice because we have some great programs coming up, and including an announcement, something new to our website that you're going to find. Coming up on Author's Voice, the next program is Lit with Love with Sonali Dave. Lit with Love, author Emily Belden joins Sonali to discuss the new book, Hot Mess. And it's restaurants and foodie culture and hot chefs who break hearts. And that's scheduled for July 31st at 3 p.m. I love Sonali Dave. She does this great show to introduce you to all of the great romance writers. The next program after that is this program again, A House Divided. We will be back again with author Manisha Sinha and to talk about her new book, The Slave's Cause, an award-winning book. And that's a history of abolitionism in the U.S. And that's at 3 p.m. on August 2nd, Manisha Sinha with The Slave's Cause. Right after that, at 5 o'clock that afternoon, we will have Paul Taylor back on our show. He was on our show once before with the most complete political machine ever known. Now, this is the history of the Union Leagues. I don't know if you've read about this, but a terrific political history of the Union Leagues, and that's on August 2nd at 5 p.m. Paul Taylor, a double feature of a double header of A House Divided. Ask a question, order a signed copy of either of these books at authorsvoice.net. Again, if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, like it, share it, order the book. That's what keeps us in business. And thank you again, Will Greene, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
And we will see you next time on House Divided.